I want to welcome everyone to the hearing dedicated to examining the future of the federal workforce and lessons learned during this pandemic. To do that, we must reflect on and recognize the heroic work our civil service accomplished during the deadliest parts of the pandemic especially. These public service servants engaged community-based health centers in the distribution of life-saving vaccines, provided health care and services to veterans, delivered the mail, prescription drugs, foodstuffs, and COVID tests, administered financial assistance to small businesses and millions of American families to make sure they had food on the table and a roof over their head. And they fought raging wildfires and other climate disasters. They administered financial assistance throughout the country to state and local governments as well. While so much has changed over 3 years, the importance of our civil service remains indomitable. With that in mind, two essential pillars drive today's hearing. First, we must renew our efforts to foster the current federal workforce to ensure that they have the resilience and resources necessary to accomplish agency missions. And second, we need to adopt policies that educate, attract, and onboard the next generation of federal employees. To support those goals, the federal government, including Congress, must work to provide competitive compensation, promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, support employees' needs for work-life balance, and encourage innovation, engagement, and collaboration among agency leadership and staff to improve agency operations. Over the past 4 years, this subcommittee has held hearings that fought to maintain a merit-based civil service, ensured robust collective bargaining rights, honored our frontline federal workers in the pandemic, explored how to rebuild a civil service gutted by the previous administration, examined the future of federal work and how it holds in store and what it holds in store for the workforce itself. At today's hearing, we pull our research together and offer a strategic vision for the future of the federal work. Despite years of effort, strategic human capital management of the federal workforce has landed in the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list for the 21st consecutive year. GAO notes that myriad items on the high-risk list result from the federal government's inability to close skill gaps and hire, train, and staff up critically in-demand skills like cyber, IT, data analytics, and human resources. Roughly 7% of the federal employees are under the age of 30, compared to 23% in the private sector. Nearly 30% of federal employees are over the age of 55, which potentially 1/3 of the federal workforce eligible to retire over the next several years, threatening what has been referred to as a retirement tsunami for the federal workforce. These are staggering numbers, and data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the private sector seems to have cracked the early career talent recruitment code, providing a roadmap for the federal government. If you look at the screen, you will see this discrepancy in detail. The red bars show the age distribution of employees across all sectors, public and private. Watch as the figures transition to the age distribution of the federal workforce in blue. Young employees make up a much smaller fraction of the federal government than they do in other sectors nationwide. The workforce is the lifeblood of our federal government. Without people committed to public service, taxpayers, vulnerable populations, small businesses, and others will not be able to get the resources and services they need. If we fail to attract and hire the best and brightest to federal service, our nation suffers. Our constituents suffer. To avoid that fate, we crafted the Next Gen Feds Act, which leverages federal internships to build a robust cadre of early career talent that reflects this nation. It's one tool, but an important tool. In addition to early career talent, the federal government must ensure that current talent can perform its work regardless of the context. Throughout the pandemic, agencies embraced telework and remote working arrangements, and it worked. Agencies delivered critical services across the country, not without problems. This subcommittee worked on a bipartisan basis to help agencies caught flat-footed at the start of the pandemic by investing in technologies that facilitate a continuity of operations. We must heed lessons learned and maintain the advantages of telework as laid out in the Telework Metrics and Cost Savings Act, a bill developed in partnership with Mr. Sarbanes of Maryland, and building upon this subcommittee's long history of support for telework, including the Telework Enhancement Act of 2010. Unfortunately, we learned some pandemic lessons a little too late. An early failure by the previous administration to adopt consistent, clear, and effective safety guidelines led to a number of federal workers contracting and, tragically in some cases, succumbing to the coronavirus pandemic while serving this nation. One of those civil servants was my constituent, Pseudomon. Chai worked in the kitchen of the daycare facility at the Marine Barracks in Quantico. When the pandemic hit, Chai worked in a tight kitchen space with additional staff where he was exposed to someone who had coronavirus symptoms. He then tested positive for COVID-19, and within a few weeks he was dead. This morning I introduced and updated a version of the Pseudomon Act seeking to codify safety procedures for the federal workforce across the board, extending beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, the bill would require the heads of every federal agency to establish a plan containing procedures and policies for the safety of federal employees, contractors, and subcontractors physically present at any covered work site during the nationwide public health emergency. It would ensure that employees are made aware of expectations, procedures, and policies that can protect them. Further, Congress and the Biden administration must make sure that every federal job is a good job. This year, the administration called for a pay increase of 4.6%, the largest annual federal employee pay raise in 20 years. I implore the administration, however, to implement a 5.1% pay raise, consistent with the FAIR Act I introduced earlier this year, which has 60 congressional co-sponsors. This pay raise keeps the federal government competitive with the private sector and deals with the inflation rate. Finally, we must ensure that our civil service is vested with expertise and not populated by political appointees alone. A Sharpie should not dictate how our federal agencies allocate first responders in the aftermath of a hurricane. We must not ignore the blazing evidence of climate change destroying communities and taking lives all across the globe, even as we speak. Our expert civil service is a crown jewel. Protections are warranted. Actions to remove those protections threaten the civil service and, I believe, the foundations of democratic society. I've introduced Preventing a Patronage System Act to put Congress in charge of which federal employees receive civil service protection. Enactment of the bill, which was included in the House-passed FY23 Defense Authorization Act, would ensure that data and evidence undergird our policies. I thank our witnesses for appearing today and look forward to implementing our vision of civil service empowered to serve individuals, families, communities, states, and this nation without regard to political affiliation. With that,